before we jump into what I have to present, I think it would be interesting to just kind of have a little discussion about the topic that we're going to be looking at today. It seems kind of scary. It seems weird. It certainly is controversial. But I think it's based on an idea that most of us would not scoff at. So let me ask you, do you think that we have a moral obligation to make our children as best off as we can? What do you think? Do you think you have a moral obligation to give your kids the best shot at life? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay, do we have an obligation as a society to make future generations as best off as we can? What do you think? Yay or nay? Thumbs up for yay, thumbs down for nay. Yay? Okay, so then the question is, if we accept that, what does that look like? How do we put that into practice? Because the topic we're going to be discussing today is reliant on these ideas that y'all just agreed to. The people who are going to be supporting this movement, idea, whatever you want to call it, eugenics, are going to say we should be harnessing the power of reproduction to make future generations as best off as we can. That does not seem like a controversial statement. But the way that these people are thinking about going about doing this is what tends to get them into hot water. Good morning.
Good morning.
So let's go through what our thinker that we're going to be looking at today, Jonathan Anomaly, has to say about this issue. And I thought I would mix it up and do a little presentation for you instead of writing on the board. Maybe that'll leave us more time to discuss this and see what issues there are with these ideas, if any. So we're looking at this guy today. I asked you to read an article written by Jonathan Anomaly, who's an American philosopher, in which he defends the practice of eugenics. He tries to put forth a case that, yes, we do have a moral obligation to make sure that our children are as best off as we can make them, and socially we have an obligation to make it so that future generations thrive as well. This guy writes at the intersection of philosophy and bioethics, so ethics applied to biological events and situations. Bioethics comes up a lot in healthcare. You know, what does ethics look like in a clinical setting, in a hospital setting? What are we allowed and not allowed to do to patients, to people who have capacity or lack capacity, etc.? But his specialization is in philosophy, politics, and economics. If you've ever heard PPE programs like this are focused on the intersection of these three disciplines. His research tends to focus on what are known as collective action problems. Does anybody know what a collective action problem is? What does it sound like? You had to guess. Just throw out a wild guess. What do you think a collective action problem would be? Yeah. Right. How do we mobilize people to think and act in a certain way? Because there's an issue that's facing us, and it's clear one or two people changing their behavior isn't going to solve things. Like, for example, if you're worried about the environment, how do we get large swaths of people to care about the environment so that we can change our policies surrounding it, change the impact that we're having on it? That's a collective action problem. Well, one of the things that he's going to be focusing on in this article is this idea that people have been throwing around for a few decades now, that Western society, and more specifically U.S. society, is in decline. And it's something that we should pay attention to. It's something that we need to discuss. And as we'll see, Anomaly is going to argue that we can fix a lot of the problems that we are having in U.S. society, bless you, by changing the way that we think about reproduction and engaging in certain reproductive practices. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. He makes it clear that his goal in this piece is to make a claim that we do have a moral obligation to make sure our personal children are as best off as we can make them, and we have a social obligation to make it so that future generations have the potential to thrive. We have to set them up for success. And he's going to link this to reproduction, how we think about reproduction, how we engage in it, how we should engage in it if we want to solve some of the social and economic and political issues that are facing us. Anomaly is going to argue that we need to start prioritizing producing people that have certain traits, that have certain dispositions, perhaps in a roundabout way that have certain genes. And already, right, if you start thinking about this, you're thinking, oh no, this could easily fall into racism, right, or ableism or classism. Well, we're going to talk all about that today. He supports eugenics. He argues that, again, we have certain moral obligations to our children and to future generations to produce strong, healthy, smart children. The question is, if we agree with him, how should we go about this in a way that is ethical and doesn't violate people's rights? He defines eugenics as follows. Quote, any attempt to harness the power of reproduction to produce people with traits that enable them to thrive. So again, let me put the question to you. If you had the opportunity to have kids that had predispositions to several different diseases or no predispositions, what would you choose? Predispositions to disease or not? Not? Makes sense, right? You don't want your kids to suffer. You might want to think about this as well. If you had the opportunity to make it so that your child is born without some sort of cognitive or physical disability, would you do that? Do you think that we have some sort of obligation to clear those obstacles away for future generations? Well, that's going to be one of the central questions that we're going to be looking at today. Any questions so far? Okay, well then let's jump into it. If you have heard this term eugenics before, it probably has some negative connotations associated with it, right? Has anybody heard this word before? Okay, if so, where have you heard it? In association with what or who in human history?
Nazis.
Right, exactly. This is a cartoon, very pro-eugenicist cartoon. One of the things that Anomaly brings up right at the beginning of this article is he talks about the association of eugenics with the Nazi movement. Now we know that historically the Nazis not only had beliefs about producing a certain kind of bloodline, but ideas about, what kinds of peoples and races should be allowed to reproduce. They engaged in experimentation on people. Well, Anomaly says it's really unfortunate that this idea of eugenics has become associated with one of the most, what you might call morally reprehensible groups that have occurred in recent human history. He says, unfortunately, support for eugenics is unfairly tied to the Nazis. When people think of eugenics, they think of the Nazis, and therefore when they think of eugenics, they think of bad. They think of evil. Well, one of the things that he wants to do at the beginning of this article is say, look, you can support eugenics without being a Nazi. Okay? Those two are not the same thing. You can think you have some sort of obligation to your children and future generations without doing Nazi stuff or having Nazi beliefs. Okay? In fact, he actually argues that the Nazis' views on race, on Aryanism, on eugenics, were actually, obviously, racist, but he calls them dysgenic. Dysgenic means what the Nazis were thinking and doing were not actually making future generations better off. Why? Well, one of the points that he makes is, if you look at different social groups, if the Nazis were actually in support of eugenics, they would have encouraged Jews to have lots of kids. Why? Because Ashkenazi Jews are incredibly successful and smart people on average, he argues. So they're actually doing it backwards. Not only were they being racist, they weren't actually being proper eugenicists. He says that we should look at what the Nazis did, and we should consider it, but we shouldn't cause, just because they believed in eugenicist principles, that we should discard those. Okay? We shouldn't allow history to prevent us from discussing real strategies that are going to allow us to combat civilizational decline or allow future generations to thrive. And Anomaly thinks that if we lean into this eugenics thing, if we change the way that we educate people, if we get people to value certain traits more, if we perhaps utilize technology in the reproductive process, we'll be able to make society a lot better. And so we shouldn't discard this potential strategy just because it's associated with the Nazis. Make sense? Okay. Here's what he has to say about this eugenics idea. Nearly everyone agrees that parents should provide an environment that promotes the welfare of their children. Advocates of eugenics add that we should also manipulate biology to promote well-being, provided we can do so without imposing undue risk on our children or on other people with whom they will share the planet. In defending eugenics, I want to reclaim the spirit of authors like Francis Galton and Charles Darwin, who believed that our reproductive obligations change with our understanding of biology and our capacity to control it. Defending eugenics does not commit us to endorsing state-sponsored coercion, nor to the parochial views held by some advocates of eugenics in the early 20th century, like the Nazis. Likewise, defending eugenics does not commit us to genetic determinism, according to which genes determine every important aspect of our personality. No credible scientist believes this. Rather, the scientific consensus is that virtually every trait that influences our personality and our likelihood of living a good life, including intelligence, health, empathy, and impulse control, has a substantial genetic component. So one of the things that Anomaly is going to be arguing in this essay is, if we want to produce strong, healthy, smart children, we shouldn't be afraid to lean into the technology that we have now to make that happen. And this is perhaps where it starts getting a little bit controversial, right? When we talk about messing with unborn children's genes, then you have worries about designer babies and stuff like this, but we'll talk about that today. One of the reasons why he's talking about this issue, and he's bringing it up, I think he wrote this article in 2018, is because, like other people in Western society, he thinks he's noticing some troubling demographic trends related to the long-term health of society. He says that in Western society, people that shouldn't be having children are, and people that should be having children aren't. And what he means by this is, on average, children are being born into situations in which parents cannot provide for them because they're often poor or they don't have the necessary privileges and resources. And that people who are wealthy and educated and can provide a good environment for their kids often, on average, have a lot less children than those who are from poorer backgrounds. And he thinks that this is bad. Okay? We want to defend people's reproductive rights and their own liberties to decide when and if to have kids. But he says if we keep letting this go on, it's obvious that society is going to get worse. we're going to start having more and more children that suffer from disease, that suffer from disability, and that are on average more stupid. And that this isn't good for the long-term health of the human race. And so, if we look at these troubling demographic trends, it doesn't look good for us unless we change things. He says, quote, "In nearly every developed country in the world, people who are well suited to have children have relatively low birth rates. Yet future people would be better off if people with heritable traits that we value had a greater proportion of children. People who don't have a lot of predisposition to disease, people who are intelligent and empathetic, people who do have impulse control, as opposed to those who have predispositions to addiction," right? If we care about the future of the human race, we should think about having healthy, smart, empathetic, kind children ourselves and encourage other people to do that as well. And that's the basic argument that he's making in this piece. As well as, he's going to say, utilize the technologies that we have to do this too. He says, "In fact, there is increasingly good evidence that Charles Darwin was right to worry about demographic trends in developed countries. The evidence is sparse because many people who pursue this research have a hard time getting it funded or published. Anomaly himself actually is no longer working in the US after the publication of this article. I'm unsure if it's related, but now he is the program director for a philosophy program in Ecuador. And after the publication of this article, a lot of people were very angry at him, and there were letters for him to resign, due to common worries that it will resurrect racism, classism, and intolerant forms of eugenics. But evidence exists. For example, a number of authors have found a negative correlation between IQ and fertility, between education and fertility, and independently between income and fertility, especially in developed countries with robust welfare states and increased opportunities for ambitious and intelligent women. The problem is exacerbated by the fact that people with more education and income, which tends to be correlated with higher intelligence, tend not only to have fewer children, but also tend to delay reproduction in the pursuit of other goals." So the implication here being that delaying reproduction too long is actually dysgenic as well. Because if you know your biology, you know that as females tend to get older in age, the risk of genetic abnormality for their children increases, right? So once women get into their 40s, for example. This is consistent, he says, with Herman Muller's observation that, quote, "It is not the having of children, but the prevention of them, which today requires the more active, responsible effort. An effort which makes demands on the participants' prudence, initiative, skill, and conscience." By contrast, Muller maintains, quote, "Persons possessed of greater foresight and those with keener regard for their family usually aim to have a lower than average number of children, in order that they may obtain higher benefits for those children that they do have, as well as for themselves and those near to them." So the idea here being, look, if you have too many kids, you can't take care of them as well as you would have otherwise if you had few kids. You can't give them the same amount of resources, the same amount of attention, the same amount of opportunities. Thus, the demographic pattern Muller identified is partly explained by the high opportunity cost of having children in societies in which successful parents can pursue other goals. Another explanation is that when especially successful people have fewer children, other ambitious people emulate them. For example, it is increasingly common for ambitious and compassionate career women to choose to have pets rather than children, or to adopt children in middle age rather than having their own. This trend may have good effects on the adopted children in the short run, but bad effects on the gene pool over the long run. Qualities we care about tend to run in families, and changing the norms surrounding reproduction could dramatically improve the human population in the same way artificial selection can improve domesticated animals. So he's saying basically here, look, we have problems that are facing us on the horizon due to the individual choices people are making with regards to reproduction. if we actually educated people on what is happening socially, if we encourage them, certain people, to have kids, and discouraged other people not to have kids, we could improve the human race in the long run. That's the general idea being espoused here. And so one of the things that he latches onto in this article is one of the worries that Charles Darwin, the famous evolutionary biologist, talked about in his writings, which is a disturbing trend he thought he noticed, which is that virtuous people were tending not to have kids, and vicious people were. And vicious here is a term of art. I don't mean like nasty or barbaric. I mean the opposite of virtue, a la Aristotle. The opposite of educated, intelligent, empathetic, good self-control. So vicious here is what's known as a term of art. Darwin was worried about this. Anomaly is also worried about this. And he says that, look, if we don't care about this as a human race, it's going to be more difficult for us to solve our problems in the long run. We're going to get probably a little meaner, a little stupider. Things won't be looking good for us. In fact, Darwin and Anomaly talk about the benefits, the pros and cons of massive welfare states in contemporary society. This is another controversial part of the article. Darwin and Anomaly are implying here that social welfare programs may be a double-edged sword. They help people in the short term by giving them the resources that they need to survive, but, according to Anomaly and Darwin, they don't help us out in the long term because they incentivize people who tend not to have good environments in which to bring kids, and they don't have the economic resources to take care of them. They incentivize them to reproduce, which, is not bad in and of itself intrinsically, but over time produces some sort of social problems. So, I've written here, Darwin's idea is, while we want to help the poor and downtrodden, resources may incentivize them to reproduce, which makes society worse off from a genetic perspective. And this is a controversial idea, right? This is not something that people like talking about nowadays, and perhaps this is one of the reasons why Anomaly got into such hot water by writing this article. But you can see the general logic, right? We want to incentivize people that we think have positive traits to make good decisions and disincentivize those who have negative traits from making bad decisions, right? Anomaly is arguing the problem is we're not doing that in society right now. But Anomaly doesn't think that, we should just go around forcibly sterilizing some people and forcing other people to have kids. Okay? He's not going to go that far. Okay? He wants to allow people generally to make their own decisions. Okay? He wants to respect liberty and freedom. And so he lays out some moral principles that can guide this project that we should be engaging in. Okay? He favors what he calls liberal eugenics, which involves people making their own choices when it comes to reproduction. This is the ideal, okay? We want to allow people to choose whether or not to have kids and how many kids to have, right? And how to raise them, generally, right? So he favors that, okay? He wants to support that. In order for that to be successful for us, there are certain ways that we might need to change society and change education surrounding sexual health. He says that people's liberties, however, should be weighed against our social and moral obligations. Now, this sounds scary and controversial, but you already accept this in other domains of your life, and let me show you how. If you were in favor of COVID lockdowns, you're already in favor of this. If you're in favor of vaccination programs, you're already in favor of this. right? Because you seem to be implying social health should be prioritized over individual people making their own health decisions, right? So you already agree with this. The problem is how far, right? How much should our social obligations be weighed against our individual liberties, right? If you're in favor of outlawing hate speech, you kind of accept a version of this, right? Because we have the right to free speech in the US, but we know that hate speech harms people, right? And so we're like, okay, let's put a restriction on speech for the sake of public health, right? So this seems like a scary idea, but I want to show you, perhaps, that in other domains of your life, you already accept this, probably without realizing it. He talks about a famous court case in this article in order to bring up some of the conditions in which he thinks controlling people's reproductive decisions would be justifiable. Okay? Drawing on Buck versus Bell, he argues that the government should interfere with reproduction only if and when the person cannot make their own choices, so they don't have capacity, what we would say in a medical context. They don't understand what they're doing, or they can't understand the gravity of their decisions appropriately. The person is a significant harm to themselves. This is something we already do, right? If somebody is a significant harm to themselves or others, we do restrict their liberties, right? By either putting them in a psychiatric ward or in a prison, right? This one's a little more controversial. When people act in ways contrary to what would produce the most good for society, but all of these conditions are supposed to be taken together, not just one individually. And when such intervention on people's liberties restricts liberty the least and involves the least amount of pain or sacrifice. So these are the conditions that he says we should accept, that we should rely on if we're going to restrict people's liberties, including in the reproductive domain. If you have somebody who can't make their own decisions, they don't have that capacity, is a significant harm to themselves, is acting in ways in contrary that for producing the most good for society, then you can justifiably restrict their liberties. What do you think? Do you agree with this? Disagree with this? It's kind of scary to think about, right? Because we're all pro-liberty in the US, right? But again, we do restrict people's liberties in some domains, right? The question is, should we do that for reproduction? Anomaly thinks we should. Thus, he recommends, finally, near the end of the article, a number of policies that might help us turn things around, that might help us change some of the demographic trends that we're noticing, that might help us better serve future generations. And I think you might agree with some of these. Let's see. He says that we should give free contraception to people. He says this is going to allow people to have more control over their reproduction. Give people free contraception, okay? Maybe subsidize it through taxation or something like that, but give people low to no cost condoms, the pill, IUDs, etc., so that people actually have more control over whether or not they have kids. Does that sound good to anybody? That policy? Yeah? Cool. All right, how about this one? Genetic education and counseling. We inform people about how sexual health works, about how reproduction works, about what their specific genome looks like. Maybe we allow people to take genetic tests, and then they meet with some sort of counselor or educator that tells them, okay, it looks like children you might have may be predisposed to this and this. It looks like they may be disposed to these positive traits. What do you think about that? Educational resources for potential parents? Classes? Giving people information about the ways that we can use technology to make their kids better off? Faster, smarter, stronger? Or is that scary? Maybe that's scary. And he says that we can install certain incentives and disincentives with regards to reproduction. So maybe something like this. Smart, wealthy people, we give them some sort of reward for having kids. Maybe we institute parental licenses. So if you want to be a parent, you need to apply for a license. Maybe we find people. Maybe in extremely rare cases, we sterilize certain people. Now that sounds scary, right? But think about what might happen in a situation like that. If you had two people who have severe cognitive and physical disabilities having a kid, they're not going to be able to take care of that kid, right? That's going to fall on someone else. They're highly likely to have those characteristics themselves. So, will they live a good life? Well, maybe, maybe not. I don't know. But these are some of the policies that he recommends. We should not shy away from thinking about this ourselves, doing this ourselves, he argues. We should be discussing this. He thinks that it is terrible that we are not allowed to have discussions like this. Because as long as we're not able to discuss it, we're not able to turn some of these trends around. And that is going to make things harder and worse for us humans in the long run. So, that's basically what he argues in this article. He supports education and the use of technology to the reproductive sphere. Okay? There are worries that come with that, obviously. But y'all agreed kind of on the fundamental premise of this idea. So I guess the question then becomes, how far can we push that? How far are we allowed to go as potential parents ourselves or as members of society in trying to make future generations well off? We already accept that we should give people a good education. We should give them a good environment. We should, take away any barriers there might be to their success as much as we can. These are all social things. What about biological things? Is that the realm that we want to enter? Should we start messing with people's genes? Should we start encouraging some people to have kids and not encouraging others to have kids? Well, we'll talk about that. There are a lot of worries related to messing with genes, and we can talk about that. For example, have y'all seen the movie Gattaca? Sci-fi movie from the 90s. What's Gattaca about?
It's about everybody's been genetically engineered to be perfect, have perfect genes.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and society develops around, well, unsurprisingly, rich, smart, fast, strong kids, basically taking all the jobs because the rich people get access to this technology first, and that increases social inequality in society, but the rich people are really well off. They get all the jobs, they get to be astronauts, go to the best schools. Maybe that's a worry you have. Hey, look, if we start dipping into this technology, that's just going to increase social inequality, right? Who's going to have access to this stuff first? The rich people, right? Maybe you worry that leaning into CRISPR and other genetic technologies like this is going to produce more racism, right? Classism, ableism is a big thing, right? That has been kind of lurking in the background of this whole thing. Another thing you might worry about is once this technology is developed and starts being used, then you have to worry about superhuman criminals or other nations getting a hold of this technology and threatening our national security, right? All of a sudden there are super soldiers flying around. Then do we have to make super soldiers? Oh. Then do we have to make super soldier cops to go up against the super soldier criminals? A lot of people are not in support of the cops right now, right? So maybe we don't want to make the cops stronger and faster. And then there's worries about, is it ethical to change things like your baby's eye color or their hair color? Is it ethical to change aesthetic things about them, right? Racial things about them? Yeah. So there are a lot of considerations that pop up with this. The hardest question, perhaps, is what Anomaly argues here. What does that imply about those in our society who do have severe mental or physical disabilities? And that's a tough conversation to have, right? Because we all want to show love and empathy, but it would seem that this view would imply that these people are going to have some of their rights taken away, right? So that's a little scary. All right, let's talk about this. Let's see what you all think. What comes up for you when you meditate on these questions, when you were just listening to what Eugenics has to say here, what Anomaly has to say here? Yeah.
The first thought that popped into my head is if we bite off more than we can chew, this won't be good in the long run for us.
So what do you mean by that?
Are we ready as a race, to start this and, just sort of start off, small, sort of harmless, but then how far are we going to push it, how far are we going to push it, and how fast are we going to push it?
Yeah, I mean, the humans are really wonderful at doing things before we should think about whether we should do them.
Yep.
Right?
Exactly.
Like, you might look at the current development of AI as an example, or, the creation of atomic bombs. Are we wise and virtuous enough to handle that technology? If not, are we going to be able to handle this in a smart and good way? That's scary, right? Yeah.
I think it's like there's so many other things that we could be worrying about before we get here.
Okay.
We're worried about, for example, poor people reproducing, or people that aren't able to sustain these children. Okay, so let's help them see where that gets us before we start messing with people's genes.
So you would be more in favor of social solutions rather than jumping into the biology. Yeah, maybe jumping into the biology is scary. It might unleash things that we don't want to unleash. Maybe we're not ready for it. Maybe it's unnecessary. Yeah.
I think eugenics, based on the idea of diseases, is understandable, but when you factor in poverty levels, it gets tricky, because here in the States and maybe other countries in the West too, our socioeconomic classes are very dependent on certain factors due to the systems that we have enabled in the past that make it harder for certain groups to succeed. So it becomes like a race issue.
It is associated with race, right? So it sounds like we can justifiably maybe use this technology to eliminate disease, you're saying? Maybe?
I think disease is more you're gonna get more people to agree that getting rid of diseases might be a benefit versus saying only people who can afford children should be able to reproduce.
Right. Yeah. I think more people would agree to, maybe using the technology to eliminate disability or predisposition to disease. My genes are not great. Okay? My family has a history of a number of different addictions, diseases, mental illnesses. Heart disease, diabetes, alcoholism, etc. Do you think it would be appropriate for me to use technology to make it so that my kids don't have to suffer with those things? What do you think? Or for you personally to do that? Would you use the technology to do that if it were available to you? We just go in there before the child is born, we get rid of that little thing that makes them predisposed to depression or anxiety or heart disease. Maybe we allow only the physical stuff and not the mental stuff. I don't know, right? It's hard, right?
So I think I have a lot of thoughts on this.
Spill them.
I think him saying that it might resurrect classism is BS, respectfully, because his entire work is rooted in classism. Him saying, oh, well, poor people just shouldn't be having kids, that's classist and also racist. It's also inherently sexist because he's not talking about women in his article, how it affects them, what it affects their genetics, because they're the ones carrying the babies. Like, we need to consider their opinions and what they're comfortable with and how it affects them in the long term, because you're editing their genes, you're going into their bodies. So I think to not consider that, and usually around genetics, that's not, or not genetics, eugenics, it's not really a topic that's considered. There's very limited articles about it. There's more now because people are starting to consider it because it is such a big thing. I think also there's more social issues that he hasn't just looking at. It's people are stupider because our education system is failing kids. People are predisposed to these diseases because we've polluted our air so much that it's literally impossible for a kid to not have asthma or be disposed to these things. There's other issues that they're not looking at that are correlated to people being stupider because of poor people, and also we're not looking at why poor people are having more kids. Maybe it's as bad as it is rape. Some people just don't have control over that. And oh well, rich people aren't having kids. Yeah, because they can afford contraception, because they can afford abortion, they can afford these things, and they can make these conscious decisions. If we stereotype poor people all the time, because we do, to be hookers, prostitutes, and people who just want to have sex, then yeah, of course they're gonna fall into that. And we've seen that time and time again with other stereotypes. So again, he's just not considering these other possibilities. He's just I just don't think poor people should have babies. That's not a sane jump to make. It's just, I don't know.
And
right in the head to be thinking that.
Yeah, and it seems like you're saying the biological things that he's talking about are the result of environmental issues.
Yeah, that we created. We did this. And also I think, oh well, the population's declined. Yeah, well, we also survived we came from troglodytes or whatever, people who didn't have these technologies and who were disposed to actual real dangers, and we still survived. So I don't think a small decline in our society is a bad thing. Also we have 8 billion people on this earth. Do we really need to be producing more? If we are looking at, oh well, we should stop having people produce, I think we should stop having we should educate people, have better sex education. Absolutely, I agree with those policies 100%, but for different reasons. Because we're overpopulating our world, not because people are stupid a little bit. And also, this reminds me of a lot of issues that are now arising of COVID babies. And it has a lot more to do with, again, the education system and people not knowing how to parent their kids, more so than just the fact that the kid was predisposed to things. People are using technology to not genome technology, tablet, computers and stuff, to teach their kids because they don't want to parent their kids.
Right.
And that's resulting in a lot of things, but that's more so because they don't know what they're doing, and because people aren't getting proper human interaction. Obviously during COVID, you can't really do that. That's super dangerous for the kid. But it's those are the issues, not because the parents are predisposed to being stupid or something like that. It's
education system base that we've created and not more so like the parents' fault. Like
Okay.
I don't know.
There are structural and systemic things that are having impacts here.
Yeah.
You're saying. So one of the things you said is that the issues he brings up are ultimately caused by social issues, right? Is that's one of the things you were saying?
Mm-hmm.
We might say social or environmental because you were also talking about, it seemed like you were talking about microplastics, processed foods, stuff like that. So the genetic stuff is already downstream of this. Okay. But then it also seemed like you were echoing this view that we've already looked at from our first unit, from Locke. His view of humanity, the tabula rasa view. In other words, nurture determines one's life path more than nature. Is that kind of what you were also saying a little bit?
A little bit, yeah. Like I think that's definitely like a really large hand in it. I don't necessarily know like exactly which determines which. That's why it's a debate. But yeah, like there's a lot of nurture that goes into a lot of these things.
But you did agree with some of the policies that he advocated for in terms of free contraception, right, and education. But the last one, right, I think you would disagree with, where he says, maybe parental licenses, sterilization, fines, that kind of stuff, because that restricts people's liberties.
Yeah, that's, I don't know, I think just like the second you start, also there's another thing, if you have to start your argument by saying, I'm not a Nazi, your argument's automatically wrong. That's just like, you shouldn't even have to like say that if your argument is sound. But yeah, like the second you start talking about like, well, I want to like genetically modify people, like that's just weird, and that's, I don't know, like free contraception and better sex education will lead to a lot of these things being better than I think he realizes, and I don't think we should ever even touch upon genome editing because it's dangerous. In a lot of cases, we don't know the full effects because it's so limitedly researched, and also again, it just doesn't consider women's bodies in a lot of these arguments, and that's really upsetting because they're the ones carrying these babies.
Or you might even say the child's body. I mean, they can't consent to any of their genes being changed, right? I mean, you may even say nobody can consent to being alive in the first place, but that's a different thing. Yeah.
I've also got several qualms with this.
Okay, let's hear them.
Like, first of all, it pretty much like dehumanizes everyone involved. Like the women are either a good or a bad vessel for the children. The children are either just good or bad traits. Like the poor people with the bad traits that they talk about, like they're not seen really as people. Like it doesn't really no one's really a human in it. Also, like with this article specifically, the way that he talks about women is very troubling because he never really puts the onus on men to do anything. He talks a lot about like women who are successful are buying cats instead of kids, and like they're 35 when they have their kids, and they're not picking good enough mates, and it's like, hey man, like I don't know, chicks can pick stuff too, like they can do stuff too. It's also like it's just so like Brave New World. Like there's no reason to play God. There's no reason to get in there and get all crazy with it. Like I think that obviously the free contraceptives and the like the sex education obviously is good, but there's I don't know. And I didn't word a lot of those qualms very well, but like it feels sticky and icky and gross, and it's like, oh man, I had one more point and I can't remember what it was.
I think I get the gist of what you're saying. Is it But is your qualms, are they centered more on his expression of these ideas or the ideas themselves?
I think like both. I have
Okay.
issue with how he talks about it, but I also have issue with, and it's also like when he talks about like making society better because we have less people with like disease or whatever. It's like, okay, diseases are like bad in general. Like most people can agree that they're bad. But then he starts talking about traits like empathy and stuff, and it's like you can't exactly quantify the perfect number of empathy in someone. So it's like you can't really decide like how that trait is good and how to make it good in a person. And also too, like as if we move in the direction that he talks about, where like everyone's richer and smarter and faster and stronger and whatever, you're just kind of waiting for the people who are not fitting that mold to like die out. Like even talking about like sterilizing them and stuff, you're just waiting them to die out instead of treating them like a person and fixing a lot of those problems.
Okay. Okay, yeah, I see what you're saying. And I lost what I was going to say too.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I do think gene editing is a pretty bad idea. I think that if we like start gene editing people, eventually we're just gonna be limiting genetic diversity because we're gonna like have these ideas of like this is what a good human should look like, and then try and make everyone kind of the same. And like I feel like inevitably it's gonna be like, well, we're not gonna have any disparities between people in like a race or class or something because, well, there's not going to be any disparities if we make everybody the same. And if we like keep messing with genetic codes, then eventually we're all just going to be like try and like make everybody like the same kind of person with the right amount of empathy, with the right amount of all these traits and things, which kind of because like I think there are it will lose a lot of perspectives of people if we like kind of remove that kind of diversity. Like disabled people have things to say too. They're just because like they're disabled doesn't mean that they don't have anything to say, that they can't contribute to society. And I think if we get rid of that, it's going to have a lot of effects that we can't like totally know right now.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that you'll come up against if you get deep into this kind of literature is, well, first of all, what do we do with people who have disabilities that don't prevent them from living a full and successful life, like blindness or deafness or muteness? You'll even find some people saying trying to discourage these people from having kids and trying to eliminate those things is deaf genocide. What do you think about that? Is that true? Is genocide kind of a strong word to use? I don't know. But it's interesting, right? But yeah, so maybe this is a good point. Like down the line, this will lead to a homogenization of humans. Not only genetically, but maybe also socially and culturally as well. Maybe.
There's several things that I see wrong with this as well. So the human genome is a very sensitive thing. DNA is very complex. The genes are very complex. We're not going to be able to, just go in and alter somebody's genes overnight. This is something that's going to have to be tested.
Right.
It's going to have to be practiced. We're probably going to start on animals.
A lot of experimentation.
A lot of experimentation, a lot of ethical problems. And when you get to the first human that's going to go through something like this, obviously, it'll be like, who wants to, you know how people volunteer to test a new drug? Okay, who's going to volunteer and do this? That's going to be a bit of a hard sell to some people. And
although those people who might be like dying very soon, wouldn't,
They might do that. I also see humans also using, humans are predisposed to war. We have a lot of prisoners. There's a lot of people that are in prison, being tortured. I can see people using the people that they consider, lesser than or indisposable, like
Mhm.
people in the prison systems.
This is what the Nazis did, right?
Unwillingly submitting to being tested. Unit 731 also comes to mind about this. A lot of our medical knowledge, unfortunately, that we have today comes from the illegal experiments done by that particular group. And the U.S. gave them immunity in exchange for all their medical knowledge and their knowledge from the testing. I can see like people getting, maybe like homeless people getting pulled off the streets and seeing them being like submitted to that type of thing, because who's going to notice if a homeless person goes missing? That type of thing. Easy test subject. I also see additionally how things could really progress from, very bad to very worse.
How so?
I'm gonna get to that. So,
Okay.
sorry. So eventually, if this happens and goes forward, there's gonna be a class division. People said between the people who aren't genetically altered and the people who are, quote unquote better. And at that point, the people that aren't genetically altered are going to be seen as sort of like a blight on society. And with Hitler, he considered the Jews to be a blight on society. And what happened to them? That was genocide. So I also see genocide happening towards people who aren't genetically altered. I see the people genetically altered saying, what need do we have for these people anymore? These people are shameful. It's not a matter of waiting for them to die out. They might just say, you know what, these people just need to be gone, and then just wipe all those people out.
Yeah, maybe you're worried about maybe the normalization of these ideas and this technology, will cause people to have discriminatory views, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Another thing that is an issue that I've seen with it is also with people with mental illnesses or disorders, there's a lot of them that you can live with it, and I think there's kids with autism who become musical geniuses, and there's these people are gonna have a different views of life, and they can help us in the future, or just help in general. I feel wiping them out completely is just wrong, because they're just different kind of people. It's not necessarily something that is wrong that we need to fix. They just see the world differently.
Okay, so I think there are two points that you're making there. One is there's real value in diversity of lived experience, because everybody has a different perspective on the world. Everybody has something to give. Okay? So there's that. Or maybe we'll say, we'll just say diversity of consciousness. Because maybe it's not only due to socialization. Maybe it also has a neural component or a genetic component or something like that. But also, I think within what you were saying is the idea that eugenics is inherently ableist, insofar as it, I don't know if that E belongs. Insofar as it presumes there are better and worse human beings. Doesn't it presume that? Right? There are some people better in some things than others, objectively. Some people are smarter than others, right? It's going to say. Some people are faster. Some people have better impulse control. Now, this is a tricky topic to talk about, because if you ever take a political compass test, it's said that one of the things that determines whether or not you are right or left-leaning is whether or not you think there are some people that are better than others. Now, it depends on what we mean by better, right? are we all not deserving of some human rights and general respect? And that way we're all equal, right? We're all deserving of some modicum of love and kindness and respect, right? But there are people who are faster than others, right? Michael Phelps, faster swimmer than I am, objectively better swimmer than I am, right? Albert Einstein, objectively smarter than I am, right? So we can say that Albert Einstein is better than me in that domain, right? So that seems to be true. Do we allow those considerations to change how we organize society? I think is the question, right? Do we allow those differences to change how we treat people or the opportunities that they should have? Because currently our society is kind of based on that, right? The people who perform well and who are intelligent are supposed to be given more opportunities, right? This is what it means to have a meritocratic society like ours. Is that good? Is that bad? Well, we can talk about that.
So I think also he doesn't consider people who become disabled later in life. Disabilities don't come just from birth, the way he's talking about it. Disabilities can come from literally falling down the stairs and like you break your back and now you're disabled. Use your legs anymore. Like
Sure. Bless you.
should those like they could that could come from any walk of life. You could fall down the stairs, something could happen to you. Do those people also suffer from this? Like should they also not be having kids? Like that's not fair. And also, I was gonna say something to your point. What did you just say? 5 seconds ago,
I was talking about people being better than others.
Oh, to your point, with like especially the political compass thing, it's definitely in context talking about like racism. Like, do you think you're racially superior to people? And then also like, I think there is an issue societally that we are giving people like better opportunities based on the way we perform, but it's more deeply rooted in racism and the way our education system is built is because people of color and people who are poor are often more so not having the best education that's specifically designed, like if you look back way when like all of that was first starting, like there's reasons for that. And the reason why white people have a lot more opportunities is because their education's better, and again, there's reasons for that. And I'm not saying like Albert Einstein like wasn't some kind of racist because he was Jewish. Like there's things, and like you can be born like disposed to being smarter and being faster. But there's also like yeah, they should be given more opportunities because they earn them, but that doesn't mean everyone else shouldn't also be given opportunities in their education to be as smart as Albert Einstein or to do things like Michael Phelps are doing. Like just because a select few were born better does not mean that everyone else should have to suffer and not have those opportunities.
Sure.
Like we
Yeah.
shouldn't genome edit to make everyone Albert Einstein, and like to the point of like diversity. Like we pride ourselves on being such an individualist country that we're like, yeah, you can do whatever you want, but we're gonna genome edit you so you can't do whatever you want. And there's also no guarantee that these people who are genome edited do anything with that. Like you can edit them to be like faster, stronger, whatever. Doesn't mean they're gonna do anything with that. What if he's like a painter? Like like there's no guarantee that they do anything for society that betters it. Like
Well, yeah, we don't have that data right because we're not.
There's no guarantee of that, and like I honestly like just to take the risk of like, oh, it might make it better. Like, yeah, it might, maybe, but we don't know. So there's no reason to try because it's such an experimental thing, and like it could hurt a lot of people in the process of us. Well, it might help us.
Okay.
Maybe. Like, is the risk worth it? No.
Okay, so you're saying it's too risky.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it, for the other reasons too, the moral reasons and the, what you expressed is the one of the leftist critiques of the society that we have, right? Which is it's supposed to be meritocratic, but it's not because it's racist, right, and sexist and these things. Yeah. As to the disability question you raised, I don't think Anomaly would say that people who suffer disability from like an accident shouldn't be restricted from having kids necessarily. It would probably depend on their genes, right? Like, are they smart? What's their IQ? You know, how good impulse control do they have? Are they addicted to anything, or are they good at insulating themselves from falling into addictive patterns? So it would be more based on genetics and mental dispositions and less on current physical circumstances, I think.
Again, I know I'm talking quite a lot, sorry.
No, that's fine. Please.
But I see a great many people, or civilians, military or government, abusing this heavily. Because it could very easily go from what people quote unquote need to have their rights limited, be sterilized, whatever, to who deserves this. Or like I could see somebody like, you know, saying to somebody who's like doctor, like somebody who's like maybe like a parental figure, or like maybe just like family, or someone that might have some say in someone's medical decisions, to say, hey, I think this person needs to go through this, and here's my reason why. And then that sort of doesn't really tie into the autonomy of that person.
Yeah.
I could also see people saying, like, oh, okay, like this person, like I don't like this person. This person should have to go through this, and then they pull off a means in which to discriminate against one particular person, and
or a group of people.
Or a group of people,
yeah.
And force them to go through unspeakable shit. Additionally, like, I mean, you see doctor. There's going to be like some type of doctor for this that people like might need to see, or like healthcare providers that you see. They know your medical history. They know everything. So at that point, like, I mean, there's probably going to have to be a governmental board, like for this whole thing, like board of eugenics or board of genome or something, and like, cause there's like boards of like doctors and different boards of scientists, and at this point, like, they might, like, I could totally see doctors like needing to report stuff to a specific borough or department, and like there's privacy laws that are going to be violated, like HIPAA. I can think of HIPAA like going down the drain. I can think of privacy laws being repealed, stuff that protects us. Like, it'd just be a mess.
Yeah, it would require a dramatic reformation in society, right? Of how we see things, of how we do things. Do the benefits outweigh the risks and the costs? Maybe it depends on how far we lean into it. I don't know. Maybe we'll be able to make people who can breathe underwater so nobody ever drowns again. Maybe we'll make people like so perceptive that they'll be able to react to things in the blink of an eye, and accidents will go way down. Vehicle accidents? I don't know. Yeah, maybe we will produce people who are so smart they solve all of our social and economic issues. I think there are a lot of reasons to be afraid and wary of this. And y'all are right to worry about it. But we also don't know how amazing it could be. So, yeah, I mean, we can't have the full picture, and we don't have it, right? Because we don't know how this is going to affect people, how this might all turn out if we lean into this. Yeah, it is thorny. Yeah.
I do think that if we like, you do make a good point about like we could have some awesome stuff going on, but also like I think if you take away a lot of the perceived negative traits, you lose a lot of like the flavor of life. Like if you take away any mental illness, you're gonna lose some beautiful art and some beautiful music, like people making stuff that comes from those negative traits.
The best art, you could say, comes out of a great deal of suffering and like anxiety and depression and
And it doesn't even have to be mental illness. Like it could be people who took a physical disability and turn it into a stand-up comedy career. Like, it's just like you take away a lot of really awesome stuff if you take away perceived bad traits.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's hard though, because while undoubtedly like some of my favorite music has been born from extreme depression, I bet if I asked those artists, would you rather be depressed for your whole life or not at all? They would say not at all.
I don't know, man. There's
Like-
also a lot of people though on the flip side who have like refused to get treated for their mental illness because they think that their personality and their art derives from that, and
Yeah.
they won't have it without that.
Yeah. And that brings up questions of when is it appropriate to force some sort of treatment on someone? That's a whole thing. Yeah.
I kind of feel like a classist divide would be kind of inevitable with this sort of thing, unless we like replace literally every menial labor thing with robots completely. If you're making people who are like super smart and super fast, they might not really want to like do these menial labor jobs, and so like they would need like this class of people who aren't gene edited, and they would have like this justification for why these lesser people should do these jobs. It's just like how kind of the racism in America works. Like with slavery, it was because you use the justification of, well, we took away these things from the people and they are clearly not as good as us, so they should be the slaves, and that's like the social justification for like why you have this. And then like with eugenics, you could be like, well, we're super smart and we can do all these things, but these people, they're not like that. They haven't gone through these things. They have all these flaws. They should do all the menial labor. They can be the lower class than us, and kind of uses a justification for this big class divide.
Okay, let me ask you this. What if I start thinking, this technology could be really fucking awesome. We could help a lot of people with this. This could fundamentally change human society. And I'm thinking about these issues, and I'm like, I know what the solution is. What if after I make it, I just give it for free to everybody? Wouldn't that solve the issues? Just give it for free to everybody. Or not? What do you think?
I think in the context of the society, that's not going to happen. 'Cause
Okay, so that's not a real possibility.
Yeah,
Unless maybe I did it. Like.
What happened with insulin, like the inventor of insulin was like, I'm going to give it for like $1 everyone. And then they were like, actually, no, you're not. And then he died and they took over it and he made like $300 for insulin. So like as much as it sounds like a good thing, it's like, oh, well, we're just Democrat, like make it free for everyone. Like that's not going to happen. In the context of what capitalism means, that's not going to happen. And then it will become a class thing. Like rich people have it, poor people don't have it, and just as a cycle or something like that. And then also with the genetically disposed stuff, people who are disabled now, like deaf people, blind people, they have kids or whatever, there's not necessarily, like there's no guarantee that their kids will have those things either. Like especially in deaf people, it is super common for deaf parents to have kids that have zero deafness, and that goes for like the majority of people with disabilities that have kids. Like for the majority, like their kids don't have that. Why are we restricting them on the possibility that their kids have that? And those kids might have a disposition, yeah, but again, there's no guarantee that their kids will have that. And sure, there's technology and that's what he's saying to find that out, but like again, like why are like what you were saying, like it's like why are you taking that away? Because that kid might do something with that. That kid, like this is what they say with like the pro life. That kid might invent the thing
Yeah.
that stops all of that. Like,
Isn't it funny that that is now coming up? Yeah.
like it's just like okay, like why are you taking such like as unfortunate it is, like the suffering that people with disabilities have to go through, as unfortunate it is, like people like Stephen Hawking, like he had disabilities and he did amazing things, like in spite of that. Like why are we taking it away when it could be something that's aiding people, that could be pushing people to do cool things and make art and do science and like what they were saying, like people who are autistic like are often like sometimes the smartest people like in the world. Like should we
like genome everyone to have autism and be super smart, like people will be like, well, no, because autism sucks. Like, so then why are we doing that with people who aren't autistic? Why are we assuming that we're the smartest? Why are we assuming people without these dispositions are the smartest?
Yeah, I think the attitude is born from looking at what people with certain traits tend to do, right? But there's, tendencies, right? Averages or that stuff. It doesn't give you any idea about what may happen in the future, right? But here's maybe something that you should think about. People are already working on this technology. They're working on it right now. You're not going to be able to stop them. If you're really worried about all of these issues that can come from the use of this technology, you should be fucking working on making it yourself so that you can democratize it. Because people are going to continue to work on this, right? Just like AI. There was a petition that came out, stop AI development. We don't know what we're doing. We could be opening Pandora's box. You think people are going to stop that? Hell no. You know, researchers in China are working on AI. In Japan, they're working on AI. In the US and Canada, Sweden. So, if this technology is coming down the pipe, and it does have all these effects, maybe the solution is not to discourage people from creating it, but encouraging the right people to create it. What do you think?
I think it's a really good perspective because, like, as unfortunate as all of these things are, like you said, like it is something that we will continue to research no matter what, like this small class at 9 in the morning says.
Right, exactly.
Like,
yeah.
As unfortunate as it is, we don't really have a lot of say in that. And it reminds me a lot of like the cloning issue.
Right.
Is like that's such a big like research spot. And people continue to research it, but like there's policies to that because the right people got ahead of it and were like, hey, you can research cloning. You just can't do these things because it literally will kill someone. So like I think if the right people get ahead of this and are like, hey, like these are your boundaries, like you can't cross these, you can't like the second that something goes wrong with the way you're doing something, stop it, like stuff like that. Like I think the right people need to be in charge of it, and I think I'm hoping that the right people are in charge of it. Just because like I don't know, like again, like you just can't guarantee the perfect world that comes from this. Like
Right.
there's a lot of issues that could arise. So like and this sounds weird because I'm like speaking against it. I'm really more so speaking against him, like the way he's approaching it. I'm not like I think eugenics when you take away all of the bad things, which he's trying to do and he fails miserably. I think it is something that is interesting that you should look into. Just to have it like in your back pocket. You know what I mean? Not to put it forward, not to do anything, but I just think it's in our human nature to be curious about these types of things. So like,
Yeah.
some people are going to research it, and I don't think like stopping research now will stop research in the future. I just think like it makes sense to want to research it. It is an interesting topic to research, but I think the way a lot of people will approach it, given the context of this society, is that's where it goes wrong.
Sure. Yeah, I'll end by just saying one thing. After our first class, at the end of our first class, I tried to encourage y'all to think about these issues yourself, to talk about all these things with your friends and family members, to really reflect on them, because I said you don't want to be walking into caves, right? And limiting yourself, limiting your own understanding. You might disagree with how Anomaly expresses some of his views and what he's seeing. But I would encourage y'all to open up discussions about this and other issues. Because if we don't talk about it, bad things are going to happen. Okay? Either people are going to be kept in the dark about it and it's going to blindside people, or if you're worried about this actually being developed and people don't talk about it, the wrong kinds of people might be the ones who are developing it and then unleashing it on people. So keep an open mind. Talk about this stuff. Really critically reflect on it. Don't just ignore it. Sound good? Maybe? Okay. All right. I'll let you all go a few minutes early. Talk about this stuff with your friends and family members. See what they think.
I did. I read it at my friend's house and I told all of them about it.